It is a true pleasure to be back in this General Assembly chamber after over a year of absence following on from the COVID-19 pandemic, this 21st century plague which has shaken humanity, particularly due to the high number of victims it has claimed, the destruction of the economies of nations and the exacerbation of poverty across the world. This in-person meeting is encouraging. It allows us to hope for a return to normal life in our countries. And this thanks to the talent of our scientists and the shared efforts of our states in remarkable international solidarity. We must step up these efforts and bolster this solidarity to truly, definitively overcome the COVID pandemic, to relaunch growth in our economies and to ensure a better future for the people of our planet. This is why I welcome the choice of the theme for this 76th session of the General Assembly: building resilience through hope, to recover from COVID-19, rebuild sustainably, respond to the needs of the planet, respect the rights of people, and revitalize the United Nations. This theme does translate our determination to eradicate COVID-19 and our desire to rebuild our destinies, our shared destinies, through multilateralism, under the auspices of a United Nations which can meet humanity's existential challenges, particularly that of achieving the sustainable development and inclusive goals. President, victory against COVID-19 will only be possible and enduring if we fight together, and if we reach herd immunity which is sufficient to protect the whole of humanity. For its part, Africa is not sitting back. It does not intend to surrender against any kind of fatality. Quite the contrary. Africa has set up a joint continental strategy against COVID-19. In this context, Africa has created a COVID-19 response fund and launched a platform for medical supplies to guarantee that all its countries have access to the necessary equipment and supplies. On the 28th of March 2021, through the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust, the AVAT, Africa has signed an agreement for the purchase of 220 million doses of vaccines, and some African countries have started the project to create the African Medicines Agency. Others are already producing licensed vaccines. By January 2022, the number of vaccines to be distributed will, in our continent, exceed 25 million doses per month. Globally renowned African researchers in medical sciences have proposed a range of effective remedies against coronavirus, which should be supported by this global organization and specialized scientific institutions. In this regard, I take this opportunity to thank all those partners who supported the continent's efforts in combating COVID-19, this pandemic. However, whilst welcoming the certain progress made by medical science regarding the detection of the virus and the invention of the vaccine in record time, unfortunately, we must note that this ill is still a long way from being eradicated. The recurrence of the pandemic is like a many-headed serpent. It is now on its third wave, which is more virulent still than the previous ones, particularly in Africa and elsewhere in the world as well. This jeopardizes the hopes stemming from the significant progress already made. This is why, to definitively reverse this current trend, the following actions are urgent, in my view. Firstly, increasing testing capacity in countries which do not have the necessary laboratory products. Secondly, ensuring sufficient swift supplies of the necessary medicines and equipment for caring for the sick. Thirdly, increasing vaccination by providing vaccines to all those who do not produce them themselves and providing them with local production capacity. I wish here to launch an appeal to the international community to support the project to create the African Medicines Agency. Fourthly, encouraging medical research and increasing scientific cooperation between university institutions. And finally, fifthly, supporting reform policies for health structures and broadening healthcare coverage to the greatest possible number of people in developing countries. President, COVID-19 does not only take human lives. It is also a virus on the world economy. It has plunged the economy into a recession, thus exacerbating the vulnerability and dependence of economies in poor countries, many of which are African. Moreover, the impact of the general drop in economic activity has been particularly keenly felt in Africa by the most vulnerable groups, including women and children, particularly through loss of jobs, drop in revenue, and losses in education. At the same time as we are trying to eradicate coronavirus, we must also look at relaunching the global economy, which might risk to make these groups still more fragile, to break their resilience, and to compromise a return to prosperity and social normality for a long time to come. We cannot win this battle except through a shared effort on the basis of a roadmap which we define together. This means we must share responsibilities and there must be greater equity and complementarity in the globalization of our economies and of international issues too. Against the current backdrop of the health crisis due to COVID-19, African economies have a huge need for financing in order to recover. All the more so since internal efforts to cushion the blow caused by the pandemic and limit its collateral damage have proved insufficient in comparison to the efforts of richer countries. Indeed, the embryonic recovery risks being unequal, thus further deepening the gaps between Africa and the rest of the world. This is why the African Union welcomes all initiatives to finance the African economies affected by COVID-19, particularly the efforts of the G20 on the Debt Service Suspension Initiative and the Common Framework for Debt Restructuring, as well as the Paris Summit on the 18th of May 2021, which launched the idea of a New Deal, the fourth summit of the G20 Pact for Africa, also known as the Compact with Africa. The ambitious reconstitution of the IDA 20 resources and, above all, a fresh allocation of $650 billion of special drawing rights by the International Monetary Fund to meet the financing needs of the economies in countries facing difficulties as a result of the pandemic. The 33 billion special drawing rights allocated to Africa in this context are nevertheless insufficient, given the immensity of Africa's needs for its economic recovery. This is why the United Nations and its member states must support the objective of the Paris Summit of reaching 100 billion SDR for Africa, thanks to the reallocation to poor countries of 25% of these special drawing rights allocated to rich countries. Part of this reallocation could contribute to increasing the capital of the African Development Bank and the World Bank. It is also desirable for these exceptional resources to contribute to promoting more vigorously youth entrepreneurship in Africa, as well as access to capital for small and medium enterprises and the green economy. It is in this spirit that I call for massive support from our technical and financial partners for the initiative of an Alliance for Entrepreneurship in Africa announced during the Paris Summit. This will hold its founding meeting in the next few weeks. The Democratic Republic of the Congo calls for an acceleration of the effective implementation of IMF resources, without forgetting the imperative of debt relief in African countries, and ensuring that all promises made to Africa are kept, in compensating for the sacrifices made so as to preserve humanity against global warming. With regard to global warming, I wish to recall that there are less than 6 weeks to go before COP26 and 9 years before 2030. For Africa, 2030 will be marked by a decrease in the GDP, which could reach 15%, as well as a decrease in agricultural income and a strong increase in the risk of coastal flooding and flooding in landlocked countries. In order to face up to these negative impacts, before that looming deadline, the African continent will require $30 billion every year to adapt. This amount will reach $50 billion by 2040. That is why I call upon the international community in general and to the Friends of Africa in particular to support the Accelerated Adaptation in Africa programme, the AAA, which is led by the Global Centre for Adaptation and the African Development Bank. This programme intends to mobilize $25 billion in 5 years to help Africa to support the shock of climate change. So, above and beyond proclamations of good faith and good intentions, the relaunch of the global economy will be a reality for all, and international solidarity will have a palpable impact, particularly for African people, in this way. President, heads of delegation, Africa does not need charity. Africa is fighting to gain spaces for liberty and action in a world which is constantly competing so as to forge a better destiny and to contribute more to the general progress of humanity. Africa needs constructive, win-win partnerships to make the most of its fabulous natural wealth, to endow itself with development infrastructure and to improve the living conditions of its people. Clearly, achieving these objectives will require strong, stable democratic institutions, as well as adequate public policy, good governance and regional integration. The capacity and dynamism of our people and the natural resources of Africa are not in question. Globally, substantial progress has been made over the last 2 decades in terms of consolidating democratic processes, achieving economic growth and combating poverty. Despite the failures of international relations and the harmful consequences of climate change. However, the scourge of insecurity caused by terrorists, armed groups mercenaries and criminals of all stripes, imperils the institutional stability of our young democracies, and annihilates the efforts by many African leaders to develop their countries. Indeed, whilst the combat against Daesh has certainly enjoyed victories in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq and in Syria, in Africa, on the other hand, ACME and other groups affiliated to Daesh are gaining ground every day. Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Burkina Faso regularly suffer deadly attacks by Daesh and the jihadists of Boko Haram. Since 2017, the northeast of Mozambique has been victim of recurrent armed attacks by jihadist Salafists, the jihadist Salafists of Ansar al-Sunnah, who have already caused at least 2,600 deaths. Islamic fundamentalism has reached the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is paying a high price in the provinces of Ituri, North Kivu, South Kivu, and Maniema. Jihadists operate there under the cover of the FDLR and the allied democratic forces Madima at-Tawhid wal Muadin movement, known as the ADF-MTM. They are killing my compatriots and pillaging the agricultural and mining products of my country. Last April, terrorists and mercenaries from Libya plunged Africa into deep mourning by brutally snatching away one of our great leaders, Marshal Idriss Déby Itno, President of the Republic of Chad, who was killed in a cowardly way when he was on the front lines defending the sovereignty of his people and country. From this rostrum in the United Nations, on behalf of the Congolese people, I support the courage and commitment of this historic figure to protect Africa against terrorism.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, heads of delegations. Africa refuses to be a breeding ground for international terrorism. This is why some African leaders, such as those of the G5 Sahel, have got together to join their forces against this shared enemy. There is a resolve and firm determination among the Congolese people and its leaders to actively participate in eradicating terrorism. Terrorism not only destroys nations and jeopardizes the future of democracy in the world, but also it increasingly extends its tentacles in Africa. Therefore, the Democratic Republic of Congo has joined the Global Coalition Against Terrorism as the 24th member. My country is delighted with the decision taken by the coalition's meeting in Rome on the 28th of June to set up within it a working group on terrorism in Africa. Mr. President, Article 1.1 of Chapter 1 of the United Nations Charter clearly stipulates that one of the aims of establishing the United Nations organization is to maintain international peace and security. Today, international peace and security are broadly dependent on member states' domestic stability. This is why, when African states are destabilized or threatened with being destabilized, in particular by terrorism, it is the UN's duty to actively support them in their heroic combat for the well-being of humanity. This must go beyond statements of compassion or intention, which are rarely followed up by action on the ground. If the community of nations minimizes the danger posed by the spread of jihadism in Africa if it does not adopt a comprehensive, effective strategy to eradicate this scourge. The open wounds in the Sahara area, in Central and also in Southern Africa, will continue to metastasize until they become a real threat for international peace and security. For these reasons, the Democratic Republic of Congo supports the implementation of a global counter-terrorism strategy focused on these pillars. Firstly, adopting a specific security policy, strengthening states' resources, in particular by pooling resources and exchanging security information, respecting human rights, and prevention. Now, on prevention, it is crucial to underscore that along with the security approach, which involves intelligence services and their work, we should promote the socio-economic approach upstream. This is focused on education, youth employment, and combating poverty in order to eradicate once and for all terrorism from our societies. As long as injustice and inequality between nations and individuals persist in the world, terrorism will always find fertile ground for it to emerge and spread. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, heads of delegations, the African people and their leaders are sufficiently aware that the development of their continent is their exclusive responsibility, and it depends on their respective countries integrating into a free trade area. This should help the movement of persons and goods and should help the sharing of intelligence, energy, and projects. The establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, ZLECAF, stems from this awareness and desire of Africans to build on their economic independence, and it stems from an urgent need for development in Africa. In a world where poor people just seem to get pity and disdain, achieving this free trade area, so making it effective and transforming it into a huge market with more than 1 billion consumers, is a challenge both for leaders but also for African elites in the 21st century. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, we are convinced that Africa will win from this, and it will meet this challenge because it has the resources and determination to do so. The main tools to achieve this great goal of African integration are the implementation of priority regional and continental projects that are part of Agenda 2063, the conclusion of partnerships between African states, the implementation of domestic policies which encourage private investment, in particular by improving the business climate, the diversification and industrialization of national economies, the peaceful settlement of disputes between states as part of the African institutions and mechanisms, according to the option plumped for by the African Union, namely African problems, African solutions. Based on this, based on the UN Charter and based on the principle of subsidiarity, since I acceded to the chairmanship in office of the African Union, I have been striving to facilitate settling the dispute that is dividing Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia on the operationalization of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that was built by Ethiopia on the Nile. To this end, I have taken the following steps. I organised negotiations in Kinshasa in April and had direct consultations with the most senior authorities from the three countries. I met with them during my diplomatic tour in June in their respective capitals. This approach has helped us identify those points that still need to be hammered out between the parties. The aim is to conclude a fair, binding agreement that would take into consideration the interests of each party by promoting an indispensable climate of mutual trust so that the Grand Dam becomes an instrument for economic and regional integration and an instrument for solidarity between Ethiopia, Egypt and Sudan. These points have been conveyed to the three countries, and in the near future, discussions will restart again. I remain confident because not only are the leaders of the three countries determined to settle their dispute through dialogue within the context of the African Union, but also because they constantly say that they are very confident in the African Union's facilitation efforts. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them. I would reassure observers and all states or institutions that have been accepted by the parties by saying to them that their assistance is most welcome. Mr. President, recently political crises have broken out in several African states. These crises must not diminish the enormous progress made by most African states in the area of democracy and good governance. I would like to reassure the community of nations that the democratization process is irreversible in Africa. The problems we're facing at the moment are all part and parcel of a laborious democratic process, but one that is being built slowly but surely and stone by stone. The African people will no longer put up with military or autocratic regimes. The DRC people are pursuing their worthy fight against dictatorship, autocracy, and anti-values which are still present. In this context, as soon as I took up highest office, I undertook political and economic actions and reforms that were root and branch in nature. I was fiercely opposed to the old guard way of doing things based on abuse and human rights violations. This led to the institutional changes in December 2020 and the first trimester of 2021. My compatriots were extremely pleased with this. They had constantly called for radical change in the governance of our country. In economic terms, the DRC has joined a program with the International Monetary Fund. It did so in June, and it enjoys assistance from the World Bank, so that it can carry out major social projects and basic infrastructure projects. Thanks to the implementation of far-reaching reforms, economic growth has sped up, overtaking 5% a year. Inflation has decreased, and our national currency, the Congolese franc, has stabilized on the foreign exchange market. Since an improvement in domestic revenue is one of our priorities, the government of DRC, since I became the head of the country, has been undertaking a rigorous policy to combat corruption and money laundering of public funds and also impunity. The results have been tangible. There's been a substantial increase in revenue since the second trimester of this year. We are constantly ensuring that Africa and the world is involved in multilateral and bilateral cooperation. We would invite DRC investors to create wealth and jobs for young people. Our country's government has already concluded partnership agreements with several countries and private investment firms. We are determined to further build on the return of trust in our country. Nonetheless, there is a serious problem that hangs and risks hampering the excellent work that the Congolese people have done. This is the lack of security in the northeast of the DRC over the past 2 decades and the bloody attacks and recurrent attacks of a number of different arms groups that do contain some Islamic terrorists. It's no secret to anyone that these attacks have caused thousands of deaths and IDPs. Women have been raped and there have been mass human rights violations. Given the ongoing existence of this cancer that undermines the country in the northeast and the difficulties encountered by the troops of the UN stabilization mission in Congo in its theatre of operations, I have decided to proclaim, and in line with Article 85 of the Constitution, a state of an emergency to bring an end to the insecurity in this strategic region of the DRC. Given this exceptional status, the armed forces of the DRC are shouldering all responsibility for the administrative and security management of these particular provinces at the same time as conducting military operations. Given this state of emergency, important progress has been made. In particular, several hundred militiamen have been taken out. Numerous members of the armed group have their actions have been stopped. Numerous weapons and ammunition has been recuperated by the DRC armed forces. Several illicit weapons and arms trafficking networks and ammunition trafficking networks have been dismantled. Numerous areas in the east of the country that were previously occupied by the rebels have been taken back. Numerous hostages who were previously detained by some armed groups have been released, and many major roads have been reopened. They were previously under the control of the negative forces, and there's been a significant decrease in incursions against civilians. These results are all an opportunity that need to be capitalized on and should rally all of us in the international community and as leaders of the Congolese people in order, once and for all, to put an end to this infernal cycle of violence imposed by the negative forces in the northeast of the DRC and to build on peace, security and stability in the Great Lakes region. It is for this reason that the DRC government is maintaining and stepping up pressure on armed This is especially because the government needs to ensure the safety and security of people and goods throughout its entire national territory. Serious sanctions have been taken against all mafia networks, whether they hamper transit routes or, and we've also imposed sanctions against multinational companies that are illegally exploiting minerals in my country and provide fuel in exchange for armed groups in terms of weapons including the necessary training to meet the needs of the realities on the ground and of this asymmetric war that is being conducted by armed groups and Islamic terrorists. And no one can contest their existence in the DRC. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, heads of delegations, in the DRC and in the world in its entirety, without peace and security, nothing can be built. Security and peace are preconditions for the progress of nations. The Congolese people needs it for its prosperity and in order to build its democracy, which is still fragile. This is why I am placing all my energy into and attaching great interest into bringing an end to insecurity, to massacres and to looting. And I'm doing all I can to build lasting peace throughout the whole of the Democratic Republic of Congo. This will be further helped by the organisation of free, transparent, inclusive and credible elections planned for 2023. It would be remiss of me to conclude my statement without reiterating once again the age-old issue of the reform of the UN and the representation of Africa within the Security Council. This cannot be repeated enough. We are talking here about the effectiveness of the UN and of the need to provide justice for a whole continent that is the birthplace of the whole of humanity and whose role is just increasing every day. It needs to play a greater role in international affairs. The revitalization of the UN, that is a topic in our discussion and during this session, is also crucial. The United Nations would make a serious political mistake by still sticking to its post-war thinking, the war of 1940 to 1945, which was 76 years ago, and focusing on that balance of power. To this end, I reiterate the African position established by the heads of state and government, which is in the Eswatini Consensus and in the SEAT Declaration. What we're talking about is having Africa represented by 2 additional seats as non-permanent members and 2 others as permanent members with veto rights, which would give them the same privileges and obligations as current permanent members. On behalf of the people of the DRC, I wish the 76th session of the UN General Assembly every success. Thank you very much.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish